it's absolutely imperative that if people want genuine social change, that the Guardian is not going to be that outlet. It's foolish to expect that from the Guardian. The issue is whether it's useful to have left voices at the Guardian. I think, yes, it is useful to have that, as long as that doesn't undermine a viable left strategy, which has to be investing in alternative outlets.
What do you make of efforts to boycott, for example, The Guardian, due to its coverage of Labour anti-Semitism crisis, of the left in general, and not to submit articles to it by people who are left to punish them?
Well, I don't think of these things necessarily in sort of moral terms. I mean, The Guardian, like the BBC, is a certain type of institution. It's not of the left, and its reporting on the Labour left was very bad. The people who are the editorial centre of gravity there were distinctly hostile towards the Corbyn project. They're broadly more hostile towards left politics. There are people who work there who are on the left to one degree or another. So The Guardian is a newspaper with some socialists in it, but it's basically a liberal newspaper, and yes, it's relatively hostile to the left. I think we could probably say broadly the same thing about the BBC. Its political orientation is much broader. They're different institutions. Like, so the BBC is supposed to represent the broad swathe of opinion in British society. So I don't think, the BBC, I don't think anyone should be annoyed about the BBC not being left wing. Like, the BBC should, the constitutional role of the BBC, in my opinion, should be to do what it's supposed to do, which is represent what is at stake in these political arguments and not misrepresent the opinions and positions of the left, which it seems to have consistently done. In the case of The Guardian, again, like, I think, to some degree, part of the problem is that people expect The Guardian to be a left-wing publication. Indeed, it tends to hold itself up as such, and when it finds it useful to do so. But the reality of the fact is it isn't. Now, I suppose there's a strategic question there on the left as to how we should handle that. Should The Guardian be boycotted? Well, I personally I'm not convinced on that. At the same time, I'm not sort of opposed to the idea particularly. The main thing I would say is that I think the left needs to have an outlet that with considerable reach. I think there's an argument for people on the left writing for The Guardian. I don't particularly see any issue with that. I've done it myself. I do think there's a difference as well between writing for an outlet and being employed by an outlet, because that preserves a certain amount of freedom, but there are limitations with that. So certain people involved in media criticism, so for example, the group Media Lens have for decades now, years and years and years, said that people on the left shouldn't engage with these media. I don't think there's a clear way that the argument can be resolved. One thing I would say is that it's absolutely imperative that if people want genuine social change, that the Guardian is not going to be that outlet. It's foolish to expect that from the Guardian. The issue is whether it's useful to have left voices at the Guardian. I think, yes, it is useful to have that, as long as that doesn't undermine a viable left strategy, which has to be investing in alternative outlets. So that means supporting left media. It means supporting institutions with a genuine interest in social change, which is different to the Guardian. Now, I don't know if that really answers your question, but in answer to it more directly, I mean, my feeling is at the moment that I don't really see the need to boycott the Guardian, provided people are investing their energies elsewhere. I don't particularly see an issue with people writing there, as long as people have an awareness of what the Guardian is. I hope it will be good. Anyway, edited collection, which Friedman's putting together for Pluto, on the Guardian, which will be due out next year, and I have a chapter in which will be examining it. So hopefully, there'll be lots of debate around the Guardian as a result of that, and how the left should relate to it. But I don't think it's an easy question. I'm sympathetic to both sides. Sorry, I don't know how much that addresses your question. I mean, push back if you like. I don't know.
I am wondering what outlets do, in your view, offer more promise for people wanting social change, major social change? Not the Guardian, but who?
Well, I'm not going to tell people what outlets to use, but basically, you have to support outlets with a different set of values, and we'll invest it with an explicit investment in an alternative set of social arrangements. So, number one, I mean, obviously, there's issues around like how you make that viable, and I think this is basically the challenge of any kind of movement for social change at the moment. And the part of the problem is that the left and broader social movements haven't developed really a way to make media sustainable. So, there's lots of outlets which I'm sure your viewers will be aware of: Tribune, Novara, Declassified, The Canary, and various other partners which are involved in the Media Fund. If people are interested in the UK scene, I'm just not familiar with outlets elsewhere, but I think the investment has to be in alternative funding models and alternative governance models. So ways in which organizations can be run more on a cooperative and democratic basis, but also ways in which the funding revenue can be detached from any ability to sort of compromise journalism, which has been the general sort of story of corporate media in the 20th century. We're coming into a slightly different period now where, with the influence of the big platforms and with sending the traditional business model into crisis, the question of, how do you build a viable business model is shifting, because originally the issue became, well, how can you actually produce advertiser funded media? That doesn't really look a viable model now anyway, i.e. like a left newspaper, a left daily. So I think at the moment the question basically is, how do we invest in a sustainable business model for alternative media? But I think the shorter term question is just, do you yourselves have the resources to be able to support media? And it's much easier to do that now, with things like Patreon. Subscriber supported services are viable, and going back to the Guardian, it's part of their actual business model now that they rely on support for readers. So I think there are real kind of openings. The entry costs for media production are much, much lower. The equipment's much more affordable, but we still have problems in terms of paying people for work. And one thing I think for me, which is the sort of lessons of alternative media from the 1990s and the early noughties, is I just don't personally think that a voluntarist model of media production is viable. You need to have people actually paid to do the job. You need to have people with a certain amount of expertise. Of course, it's great that anybody can produce anything and towards the media ecosystem, but if you want something that's able to compete with the right, then you need to have resources and expertise. You need to be able to pay people to do jobs and develop sources and do investigations and so on. So these are sort of important social functions which the left at the moment isn't able to perform, that you can have a sort of, a lot of commentary and a certain amount of expertise, but there are other things which are more expensive and more difficult, and I don't think it's clear quite yet how you make that viable. But people are doing important work, so the key thing is to support initiatives and allow that kind of ecosystem to develop and see what works and see what doesn't, and exchange expertise, develop models.
Thank you very much for this interview, Dr. Mills.
Thank you for having me.